Good evening all, and welcome. Let's start the year strong with some ghost stories. What would also help is that if you're new here or listen frequently, why not subscribe? You may not have done that already. And follow me on Twitter and Instagram for good measure. I'm sure you'll love it. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My dad called me last week and said something kind of creepy had come up on his security camera at around midnight. Everyone was in bed asleep at that point, but the next day my dad got his usual notification of random movements of the camera outside the house. They are that type that turn on and it detects movement, so my dad just flipped through them expecting to be a normal mix of dog or wild animals, but this was like nothing he'd ever caught on camera. The figure appears to appear on the left-hand corner of the screen, walking around and turning towards the house before vanishing. My dad's house is off the road with a long driveway. The gate also locks at night, so it's not possible for it to be a person. My dad showed it to his friends, and people had all kinds of theories, from a bug's leg, to a light on the ground, to even a spider's web on the lens. The last kind of creepy thing my dad said was that as they were gardening in the morning and dug up around there, they found some odd-looking rocks. Dad even made a joke it resembled a tombstone. Now, I'd appreciate help. If this is like anything you've ever seen before regarding paranormal footage, should I be worried about future hauntings? My dad's worried about my little sisters, as they are kids, and doesn't want to tell them that there could be ghosts around the house. My father tells me this story of my childhood every once in a while. When I was around 6 years old, my dad's best friend ended his life. His name was Joe. Obviously, it was a very rough, emotional time for my dad. Joe was my dad's best man at his wedding, the one guy who was always there for him. After my dad got married, he and my mum left Joe and the town they were in to start a life outside the town they grew up in. After years of moving around California, my family eventually moved to Utah, where my father worked for a successful internet business. Joe stayed behind in Washington because my family was so far away from their old life with Joe. There wasn't a lot of foresight and warning that Joe intended to end his own life though. Joe's sister apparently had been blaming Joe's wife for her brother's suicide. Joe and his wife drank a lot of booze and probably as a result fought a lot. My father had always said they were a passionate couple. Yes, they would fight often, but he hardly knew two other individuals who were so completely in love, and for this reason he didn't believe it. A few days after Joe ended his life, his widow called up my father sobbing, saying about how she thought it was all her fault. After about an hour's worth of crying and trying to console her, he told her, "If there was a way for me to talk to Joe right now, I guarantee that he would tell you that he loved you and that it wasn't your fault that he ended his life." Crying, she still didn't believe him, but she thanked him for the kind words and let my father go. My dad was obviously distraught after that long, hysteric conversation. He had been down in his office for a while and decided to come up and check on his kids while making a pot of coffee to take his mind off things. We were all supposed to be napping, but he thought he'd peek his head into our rooms to make sure we were safe, maybe try to have a little smile or brightness added to his day. Sure enough, when my dad got to my room, I was fast asleep on my bed. He went to my brother's room, and he was also sleeping. Finally, he checks on my sister, who's sleeping as smugly as an angel. He decides to go back towards my room and enter the kitchen to make some coffee. As he walks by my room, he notices a whimper. He turns around and enters the room, where he finds me weeping. I was 5 years old, so the way I was crying seemed odd to him. Normally, a 5-year-old would cry drastically or over-dramatically, but I wasn't. I was just sitting on the side of the bed weeping. My dad enters the room and says, "Matty, what's up? Why are you crying?" It's then that I stop crying for a moment, look at him with teary eyes and say, "Rick, It's not her fault. I love her. It's not her fault. With that, I stopped crying, rolled over back into bed, and fell swiftly back to sleep. Needless to say, my dad crapped his pants. I was tucking my 3-year-old son into bed the other day. We say the typical slews of I love yous, and then he stops talking, which is extremely atypical. He has maybe shut up once his entire life, so he puts his head down on the pillow, kind of pointing his face down, and rolls up to look at me. His arms were down by his side, and he just points one little finger towards the rocking chair in the room. Without moving, he says, "Mummy, before you leave, can you take the rocking chair out of the room, so the man will leave me alone?" I'm pretty sure all the colour drained from my face. He then proceeds to tell me that the man's name is Johnny, and he's a bad man and very mean. Johnny doesn't say anything though, because he doesn't have a mouth, and just sits there and stares at my son. In 2001, my grandpa, who I always referred to as Pop-Up, was diagnosed with prostate cancer. I don't know the details, but I remember thinking it wasn't too bad, because my whole family played the whole thing down constantly. I had never suffered a death in the family. I'd never even seen a dying person before, so I had no way to judge how Pop-Up was actually doing. So I accepted my dad's insistence that his father was doing just fine. Eventually the doctors told my family to take Pop-Up home. My parents assured me it was because he was getting better. Obviously my dad would be at my grandma's and Pop-Up's house every morning to help out, but after he had done everything he could for them, he would return home and ask if my sister and I wanted to go see them. We would obviously say yes, and he'd hop back into the car and carry us back out to their house. One day I remember having a really strange dream. It was cowboys and Indians. I've never been interested in westerns and all of that, but my Pop-Up loved them. Suddenly, he appeared in my dream. Well, not in my dream, more like in front of it, and he mouthed something inaudible and I woke up. I looked at the clock. It was around 7:30. Way too early for a 13-year-old boy to be up. But the dream had shaken me, so I had crawled out of bed. My sister was already up, which was equally strange. I said good morning and grabbed some cereal, and around noon my dad came home as usual and asked us if we wanted to see Grandma and Pop-Up. By this point he knows he doesn't need to ask, but habits are hard to break. We load up the car and head on over. Here's where everyone feigns surprise out of politeness. Before my dad turns the car off, he says, "Guys, I have some news for you. Pop-Up died this morning." I was stunned, for many reasons. Obviously, first, I thought he was getting better, and two was because I recalled the dream and realized that it was my Pop-Up. He was mouthing goodbye. I later realized he had died at 7:30 that morning, the same time he appeared in my dream. Furthermore, my dad would always bring our dog with him to my grandparents' house, a little Jack Russell named Lucky. Lucky would always hide under the hospital bed my Pop-Up was in. The day Pop-Up died, Lucky skulked out from under the bed, and as he took his last breath, Lucky took off on the far side of the room and let out a chilling howl. When I was around 17, I was at my friend's apartment building, which his parents owned. We had an apartment to hang out in on the top floor, and used to go to the roof to smoke. That night, we were about to go up, but I had to pee, so I told him I'll meet you up there. After I was done, I went to the stairs to the attic portion that was connected to the roof. There were no lights up there, so we used our phones to guide us. It was an old building, and the attic was creepy and cluttered all the time. As I made my way to the roof door, I saw a shadow pass by me. I followed the direction it went, thinking it was my friend. I kept saying that I knew it was him and to stop playing around. It passed me a few more times when I heard my friend's voice from downstairs. He got a call from his girlfriend and was in another room talking to her the whole time. I have no idea what that shadow figure was, and I still refuse to go back up to that roof at night after that. I once had a friend that I knew for almost 5 years. I met him when I was only 11, and he was about 20. Despite the shady age difference, he never did anything that would make me think he was a creep. He was protective, yes, but in a fatherly way. My father was deployed to Iraq when I was 10, so he was like the substitute while my dad was miles away. We usually talked over Skype, and we would talk hours at a time. I had a friend who also talked to him, but not as often as I did. About a year ago, he died in a car accident with his cousin in Europe, and of course I grieved. It wasn't often that I would cry over anything, but this was something that hit me hard. This is only a little bit of a backstory. So I've always been someone who's trusted their gut, and strangely enough, even in my dreams, I've had small, harmless dreams which I experienced the same thing a few days after the dream. One night I had a dream. I didn't remember much of it. I always thought of it as just being a stupid, weird dream I had. I was outside someone else's house. We were jumping around on a pile of junk, and just as we were having a good time, there was a fallen tree leaning against the pile. I don't recall much from the dream, but most of the scene I was placed in. Of course, it didn't bother me, it wasn't scary, so it didn't worry me. A few weeks later, my mum suggests I spend a week at my cousin's house who lives out in the country. Of course I accept, since I wanted to get out the house for a little while. That week I headed down to where they live. They had a huge yard with a silo, a barn, and a worn-down hog barn. Right next to the hog barn was a large pile of metal sticks, rugs, and basically a bunch of trash. Next to that was a tree. It was split in half, with one half leaning against the scrap pile. I didn't quite think of the dream since my memory is pretty bad at times, so I just saw it as normal. The first week goes by and my cousin suggests we go outside for a bit. I agree, finding nothing else to do in their home, and we go out and walk for a bit and talk before I make it to the scrap pile. I was the one who suggested we climb around it, so we did. We both climbed to the top and found a cozy place to sit. I sat on one of the branches of the broken tree, and she sat further across the pile from me on an old rolled-up rug. I can get pretty hyper at times, and it makes it hard for me to sit still sometimes, so I started bouncing on the branches. Of course, our 160-pound girl bouncing constantly on the branch is going to make it snap, and that's when it did. I snapped, and the tree fell. I tried to grab onto whatever I could, which was a small twig, which snapped easily and sent me falling. I fell straight on my back on an old gutter that was facing down. The sudden events left me shocked and unable to move, and as I was slowly rolling off the gutter, below the gutter was a thin metal, sharp, jutted metal sticking up that was surely going to impale me if I'd continued rolling over. As I rolled though, I felt someone grab my arm. They pulled me back to balance on the gutter, and I was able to sit up and safely balance myself. My first assumption was that it was my cousin who helped me. But the creepy part, I was about to thank them for practically saving my life, but then I realized she was halfway across the pile. Her foot fell through a screen and she couldn't get to me in time. Apparently I had rolled myself back before I rolled off, but I swore I felt someone pull me back. Someone who probably saved me from being impaled and getting severely injured. I immediately told my aunt about this, and soon my mother agreed with me that it could have been anything, but we're both convinced that it could have been my father figure, that he's watching over me. Tell me, what do you think of the situation? Because ever since then, I'm still contemplating on what it really could have been. Many years ago, when I first met my ex and her family, they lived in a mobile home. My ex has this younger sister who is a bit messed up, in and out of psych wards and stuff. My ex and her younger sister shared a room in this mobile home. While we were dating, and before my son was born, she told me this story about how her younger sister would wake up and talk to the man in the hallway. The man always had a suitcase and wore a brimmed hat. My ex and her family always dismissed the stories, as the younger sister was a bit nuts. Fast forward a few years, my ex and I had a son together. Her parents moved out of the mobile home and into a house, and we were renting the mobile home to my ex. Our son's room was in the exact room where my ex and her sister had slept in. One night after our son had gone to bed, he was asleep for a while, and we heard him get out of bed. We figured he would come out of his room and ask to use the potty. Instead, he started talking to someone and said, "Hi," and started talking about his favorite stuffed animal, which at the time was Ducky. Curious, I called back and asked who he was talking to. He pops his head out of the room and informs me he's talking to the man with the suitcase and who's wearing a hat. At the time, he was about 2.5, and had never heard about his aunt seeing the exact same guy. I have a younger brother who had an imaginary friend in his youth. He was also an avid sleepwalker. When he was around 3 or 4, he started talking to someone he called Friar. He described Friar as a dark-skinned man with little clothes who loved to hunt in the wilderness. Then one day, he told me that Friar used to live nearby in a house a long time ago, and then some white people came and burnt him alive and killed his village. Not exactly something you expect to hear from a 4-year-old. I remember I would be in my room and hear him talking like he was having a conversation, and when I would try and check on him, he would immediately become silent and turn his head as soon as I peeked around the corner. Very unsettling. While my older brother, the middle child, was visiting his dad for the summer, but the day before he got back, my youngest brother told my mother and I that Friar does not like it when brother is mean to me. He's gonna scare him. The night he got home, my mum and I were downstairs and heard a scream that I can still remember to this day. We ran upstairs and found the middle brother swearing that something was shaking the bed violently. It was a bunk bed. My youngest brother was sound asleep. A month later, my youngest brother took a bad fall and cracked his skull. He was fine but never spoke to Friar again after that. He would also sleepwalk constantly and show up right next to me in bed and stare at me until I woke up and promptly crouched myself. One night I heard the front door open and close, and since it was 4 a.m. I went to check it out. I opened the door and found my brother at the far end of the yard, in the snow, only in his underwear, staring right at me. Then he slowly waved. Those shivers weren't from the cold though. A few years ago, my brother would get a call on his cell phone at around 2 to 3 a.m. every night. He would answer it, and it would be this hellish sounding noise, like static mixed with screams. He changed his cell number after about a month of it and it stopped. Then after a week or so it began again. The exact same noise, the exact same time. Finally one day he decided to backdial the number. It was an old man that had no clue what he was talking about, and still the calls persisted. If he didn't answer, it would call a few more times. No messages were ever left. He decided to say screw it, end his contract with the phone company, switched to a new one, and then got an entirely new number. You guessed it. The screaming, static calls continued after a short delay. By this time he was terrified every night, unsure why this was happening. He backdialed the number again and got a different person. Around this time he lost his job and his phone. The calls stopped, of course. His phone was disconnected now. So one day my mum asked me to listen to this weird message she got on our home phone. It was the static screaming. We showed my brother and he was freaking out. He backdialed the number again, and it said the number was disconnected this time. Never heard from it again after that. A few months ago, my 3-year-old daughter had the flu. After she was feeling a little better, my wife took her outside into our backyard to play. My wife was sitting on the back step, and my daughter came up and asked her if she could play with the little girl on our slide. My wife said, "I don't see a little girl." And my daughter said, "She is right over there on the slide, Mum. Can't I play with her?" My wife said, I don't see anyone, but my daughter insisted. She is. She's on the slide and she's blue. Can I play with her? My wife freaked out and said, let's go inside and make a snack. So they did. For the rest of the day, my daughter kept going out and looking at the back door and kept telling my wife that the little blue girl was lonely. I attended the same university for my bachelor's and my PhD. There was a lovely woman by the name of Jennifer, who was my reading in the content area instructor. The guys all swooned over her as she was gorgeous, and I loved her because she read us The Giver out loud. She was an awesome instructor and was doing her PhD in literacy. Fast forward a few years, and Jen had moved to South Carolina to teach literacy. I'm now in my PhD program and in the same grad student office she used to work in, with other literacy people and her colleagues. And then we get the news that she was murdered by her boyfriend. Everyone is in total disbelief and devastated. It was a huge blow to the department, as she was genuinely loved by everyone who knew her. So after a few days, her funeral and her body were brought home. I'm in the office suite at school very early in the morning when no one else was about. The grad students had a fishbowl office, 10 of us with group desks within a larger office suite that was locked and had light motion sensors. I'm walking in and past a locked door with windows when I see a woman with short dark hair walk the other way inside, which was weird because the lights didn't flicker on as she moved. So I walked around the corner to the door with a key code and let myself in. I walk inside and head to where I saw her. The lights flicker on when they sensed me, but no one was there. It's just me and an entire suite of empty offices. I swear to God it was her saying goodbye to a place she spent so many years at and where she had so many friends. It spooked the hell out of me though, and made me very sad. I figured I'd share with you some strange and what I believe to be paranormal experiences happening at my place of employment. I work at an old restaurant in a city in Oregon. I will not say which or which city for obvious reasons. The restaurant has been around 35 years, so you can already imagine how old the building is. I work as a bread baker during the night hours. My shift is usually from 8:30 p.m. till about 3 a.m., depending on which products need to be made. My co-workers tend to leave at around 10 o'clock. Sometimes the dishwasher is there for a bit later. Thought I got lucky moving here and landing this job right away at $13 an hour, and now I don't feel so lucky. My first experience was the second month of working there. I had just put some hamburger buns in the proofer and had some time to kill, so I walked into the dining area to make myself an espresso. Halfway there, I noticed a faint whistle coming from the dining area. I shrugged it off, as it stopped once I entered. As soon as the espresso was done, the whistling started again, but louder. I couldn't make it out, if it was a song or something else, but it went on for about a minute, then stopped. My whole body shivered, as I was definitely creeped out. The next day, I mentioned this to the dishwasher, and she looked at me for a minute and then sighed. She told me that the building is most definitely haunted, and she constantly hears the whistling as well, but only when she's here alone. The conversation ended there. She doesn't speak English very well. This experience freaked me out pretty bad for a few days. I still get chills thinking about it, and you may not think it's creepy, but it was. We have a huge walk-in cooler, filled with tons of prepped food and so on. This was around 11 p.m, and the dishwasher is still there. I walked into the cooler to grab some butter. The door is huge and heavy, so there's no way wind could shut the door, especially because there was no wind to shut it. As I was reaching for the butter, I heard the door slam behind me. I was obviously startled and thought maybe the dishwasher closed it, thinking I left it open by accident. I walked to the door and started yelling for her, hoping she would hear me. After about 3 minutes of no response, I panicked. It It was super cold in there. I kept banging on the door and yelling, and about 10 minutes later she finally heard me and opened the door looking confused. Shivering, I asked her if she closed the door on me and she said no. I told her the door closed on me, and the look on her face freaked me out. I texted my boss and told him what happened, and asked him to check the security cameras. When he answered, he told me he watched, and said that he saw me walk in, and 10 seconds later the door slammed shut. No one was behind it. It just shut by itself. That's never happened to anyone else. We were both confused, and I was wary. A few weeks later, in the dining room they mopped the floors every night and put the chairs on top of the tables. I noticed they were in their usual spots on the tables and didn't think much of it. As I was making bread dough at around midnight, something happened that I can't explain. In the span of almost 5 to 10 seconds, I heard the loudest crash coming from the dining area that shook the whole building, and the lights went out quickly, then came back on. My heart was beating so fast and I felt nauseous. I had no idea what just happened. I ran into the dining room and my heart sank from fear. All the chairs were on the floor, scattered, a few definitely broken. Then the whistling began. I immediately called my boss and he rushed over. We went to the office and watched the security cameras. The videos showed the chairs on top of the tables, the lights go out, come back on, and the chairs were scattered all over the floor. The look on his face chilled my body with dread. He promised to stay with me for the rest of the night, and I told him I was becoming scared of working by myself. He said I would be fine. This happened a few days ago, and it took everything in me, aside from the fact that I'm living paycheck to paycheck, to not quit this job. This was probably the scariest thing I've ever experienced. It was around 2:30 a.m. The baguettes were in the oven, and it was almost time for me to leave. I had to use the restroom, so I walked to the dining room to get to the restroom. I heard the whistling, but very faint. It was becoming normal, and since nothing had happened for a while, I wasn't creeped out. I got to the restroom. It's a one-person. Locked the door and sat down to do my business. About 30 seconds in, I hear a faint whisper come from outside the door. I chalked it up to hearing things. Then I heard someone knock very lightly. My heart stopped. I was alone, or so I thought. I sat there in silence. Another knock. I very quietly finished my business and pulled myself together. I stood somewhat close to the door to try and hear what was outside. Another knock. And then I heard a faint whisper say, "Hello." I almost screamed, and almost wet my pants, even though I had already peed. I kept quiet, in the fear that this maybe wasn't a ghost but a junkie or creeper who managed to slip inside somehow. It knocked again, louder this time, and the voice whispered, "I know you're in there." It sounded like a man's voice, but I couldn't tell. It began to jiggle the handle of the door, and that's when I flipped out, screamed to leave me alone, and the handle jiggled more violently, and then abruptly stopped. I stood there in fear for about a minute. It slammed the door so hard I was surprised it didn't fling open. My heart was racing and tears were streaming down my cheeks. Everything went silent for a good 20 seconds. There was another loud bang that shook the whole restaurant again. The door swung open so violently, and no one was there. I ran out of there so fast, screaming and crying. The chairs were flung about, tables turned over, coffee cups shattered on the ground. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed my things, shut the ovens off. Hell, I didn't care if the baguettes were done or not, and ran out the building to my car. I called my boss, sobbing and hyperventilating, and he told me to wait in my car. He arrived 5 minutes later, flying into the parking lot in his car, got out, but I told him I was not going back in there. He went inside and came out about 10 minutes later, looking weary and upset. He told me he watched the security footage and couldn't believe what he saw. As soon as I had closed the bathroom door, he saw a sort of dark, cloud-like figure float in front of the door. Right before the bang, the camera went to static for a few seconds to show the whole dining room a mess. Then the camera showed me running out of the bathroom. It's only been a few days since that happened. I'm still shaken a bit by it. My boss gave me the week off, paid time. I need to think this through. Is it actually worth it? Working in constant fear? This is my brother's story, not mine. He is the janitor at this church and he works late at night. Before he started working there, he not only didn't believe in ghosts, but he literally thought that those who did were of an inferior intelligence. The first experience he had was when he was trying to study in this one room at the front of the church. He was trying to study, but the noise started, and it sounded like whispers in a language he couldn't understand. He thought his brain was playing tricks on him, so he kept trying to study. But the noise got progressively louder and louder until he couldn't take it anymore and ran out the church. The scariest experience he had was one night when he was vacuuming. He had a phone at the time that would super annoyingly inform him every 5 minutes for the hour before it died that it had low battery. He was vacuuming like he always did, and then he received a call. It was from the church's phone number, and before he could pick up or reject, his phone instantly died. He started sprinting to his car, and he heard the noise of the door in front of him open even though it just stayed shut. He told me he smoked 14 cigarettes in his car on his 10-minute drive back to his place that night. Then, after having these experiences, he started asking other people who worked for the church if they'd had anything strange happen to them. All of them said yes. The scariest one was of this lady who works in one of the offices in the church. One night she was working late, and the church was empty, when this old woman who she knew appeared out of nowhere. She was all like, "Hey Mabel, coming to service tomorrow?" But Mabel ignored her and continued towards the stairs and started walking up them. She was very confused and felt that Mabel was being rude or perhaps didn't hear, so she left her office to go upstairs and find Mabel, but there was no one there. When she got to the top, she remembered that this particular old woman had had her funeral in the church recently after dying the week before. And now that I can talk about my own experience, I was once closing up an event at the rec center I work at. I was locking the doors and picking stuff up and doing general cleaning when I heard 2 notes played on a piano in the big event room I was in. I asked who was messing with me and looked around, and there was literally no one there. I am a janitor, and this happened about 5 years ago. I've been working at this place for a while now, and I've seen some creepy and weird stuff, and I'm almost always alone because I lock up the building. When this happened, it was about 5 o'clock at night. Everyone was leaving. I was going to change the outside garbage in front of the building. As I was walking out, there was this girl sitting in one of the chairs in the lobby waiting for her ride. I nodded to her and smiled and walked out and started changing the bag. Now the trash can is directly outside the doors, so I would have seen anyone walking out. And there are windows everywhere, so I would have seen people get up and leave the room as well. It only takes me 20 seconds to change the bag. I walk inside with the trash bag full, and I look at the chair and someone completely different is sitting there. It was also a girl. She notices me staring, and, lost for words, she gives me a weird look. "Was there anyone sitting there when you came in?" She gives me a weird look. "No." "How long you been there?" "I was directly behind you when you walked out." "You didn't see someone else there, another girl maybe?" Her face goes white and concerned with a mix of fear. "No, I didn't." I was lost for words and walked back in. That girl was nowhere to be found and I haven't seen her since. Keep in mind, I've seen a lot of stuff and heard weird things in this building. I've even heard my own name through a podcast, and the lights flickered. Shortly after the birth of my first son, I had a strange experience. While I was laying in bed with my newborn, I experienced that unmistakable feeling of a cat walking across the top of my pillow. I thought maybe one of my own had snuck into the bedroom, and so I sat up to swat it away, but nothing was there. My door was closed and no cat was in the room. At another time, I also fell asleep, laying with my son. I felt a cat jump onto the foot of my bed and walk up to about my knee and stop. I sat up, but nothing was there again. It really freaked me out. It happened maybe 3 or 4 times and then suddenly stopped when our son was baptized. It made me really stop to think, could this not have been a ghost cat after all? But perhaps something more sinister. I've seen a few strange things in my life. My grandma had this cat for a few years, an obese orange and white tabby. It kind of comes and goes, called Butter. He met with an untimely end, so we buried him in the woods behind the house. One day we were all having tea and toast, and I walked by his couch to see him sitting there grooming himself, legs straight up in the air. I kind of waved at him to swap me and say, "Hi, Butters." He stops and gives me that eyes half open stare and goes right back to town grooming. I walk into the kitchen, waited for my toast, and stare at the photo on the fridge of this fuzzball of a kitten, and realize that Butters is long dead. I slowly turn around and everyone seems to notice and ask me what's wrong. I tell them what I've seen, and my grandma gives me a somewhat pleased look to hear that her cat is visiting. I'm pretty sure we have a ghost cat in our house. It has happened often where people will ask if we have a cat on their first visit. When we answered them no or why, they usually all would say they could have sworn they saw one out the corner of their eyes. I have personally seen it once, clear as day, but it was there for a second and then it was gone. I personally like having it around. I don't have to feed or take care of it, and yet it keeps us company. Anyway, I figure if you're going to have a haunting, it could be much worse. I'll take a cat any day over a creepy shadow figure. When I was about 4 years old, my house caught on fire. My bedroom was on the 2nd story, and the fire was on my side of the house, so my room filled up with smoke. I remember someone waking me up that night, thinking it was my mum. It was a sweet woman's voice and told me to go sleep in my sister's room. I was never allowed in her room. I was the annoying younger sister. Then my mum woke up later that night to the smell of smoke and went to find us. She said my room was so filled she couldn't even see her own hands. In a panic, she went to wake up my sister to help find me, and she found me asleep on my sister's bedroom floor. If I had not woken up, I would have suffocated in my sleep. I had burn marks on my floorboards until 8th grade, when we moved out. When I was 5, I had my first paranormal experience. I lived in a small town in Washington called Colfax. I lived in a big house that overlooked the town. The house had 2 stories, and my room was on the 2nd floor. My parents stayed in a room on the bottom floor, so I was upstairs by myself all the time. At night, I would be awoken by my door being opened. This black figure would come in and stand next to my bed. The first times I saw it, I thought it was my mum, so I said, "Hi, Mum," but there was no response, so I just rolled over and fell back asleep. I asked my mum why she would come into my bedroom at night, and she got a confused look on her face and said that she never did that. So I got curious. That night I decided to see who was standing next to my bed. That night, when the figure came in, I looked at it in the eyes and realized that I couldn't look into its eye. It had none, or face for that matter. It literally had no face. It was just this black void that seemed like it was endless. I laid there frozen in fear and just stared back. After a while I gathered myself again and continued to just lay there because I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't afraid of it, because I figured if it wanted to harm me, it would have already done so. So after a while I fell back asleep, and when I awoke a little while later, it was gone. I told my mum all about it, and she told me that I was just dreaming and that I had an active imagination. I learned not too long ago that she would actually come up to the hall outside my room and stand there for a while, but she never saw anything. She also abandoned the effort after a bit. I wasn't the only one to see this figure though. My friends came over for a sleepover one night. We were all up until about midnight, mainly because my mum told us it was unhealthy for us to be up late, and we were up for another hour talking before we all fell asleep. I had mentioned the ghost that came into my room at night, but never talked a bunch about it. We were awoken by my friend Sophia screaming. We all got up and asked her what was wrong. She said there was a ghost in the room. My friends told her that she was just trying to scare them, because I had said something about a ghost that came into the room. My mum came up a few minutes later, and my friends told her that Sophia had a nightmare. The next day at school, I spoke to her and asked her about it. She told me that there was a dark figure standing in the middle of them, since they were sleeping on the floor around my room in sleeping bags. When she screamed, it quickly disappeared. I told her that it comes into my room every night, and it was friendly and never said anything and just stood there. Sophia came to sleep over a lot since we were young and nobody cared that we stayed in the same room. We would sit there and it would come in. We tried talking to it, but it would never respond. I'm 17 years old now, and have since moved away from the house, but still at night it comes to my bedroom. It's followed me wherever I've lived, but does not come into my room as often anymore, or at least when I'm not awake. I'm not afraid of it. I know it doesn't want to scare me. I take comfort knowing it's watching over me, and I'm curious if this is something that has happened to others. When I was a kid, I spent a lot of time at this house that was the headquarters for a small theatre company that I worked for. There were several stories that people had about seeing various ghostly things there, but one of the ones that kept coming up was a ghost cat that a couple of different people claimed to have seen. Now fast forward to 2 years ago, my girlfriend and I were staying at the house for a few weeks while we were working on a show. She had only become involved at the theatre recently, so I didn't know any of the old stories. There was an actual cat living there at the time, and we always slept with the door closed because we're both allergic. So one night I wake up to get her out of bed, and she's saying something like, "Come on, Persephone, get out of here." Then bend down as if to pick something up, then gasp, then a moment later climb back into bed. The next morning she told me she had a dream where she heard the door open and she got up to see a cat in the room, and figured Persephone had pushed the door open to come in. So she got up to pick her up and put her out again, but as she reached down to grab the cat, it disappeared. Since that's not what's supposed to happen, she figured it was still a dream. So I said to her, "I think you met the ghost cat actually." And she was like, "What ghost cat?" So I told her the history of it, and she asked me to describe what people had seen. A white, short-haired cat, as opposed to Persephone, who's a grey and long-haired. At which point she sort of freaked out, because what she had seen had appeared to be white, but she had just assumed it looked that way because of the lighting. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's ghost stories. Please don't forget to subscribe if you're new here, as that is very much appreciated. And why not follow me on Twitter? Link in the description. That would really mean the world to me. Another goal I have, other than 1 million subs, which I know is lofty, is 10,000 followers on Twitter, which I think is far more attainable. I hope everyone is doing well. My voice seems to be fully recovered. I woke up feeling really good this morning. Still a little bit of an improvement to go, but generally feeling pretty good. I hope everyone else has had a really lovely day, and yeah, just keep carrying on for the new year. Stay awesome everyone, and I'll see you in the next one.